So think of the smartest philosopher you know.
Okay, I have someone in mind.
Right. Now think of someone relentlessly hunting for abstract, objective truth. But what if all that intellectual heavy lifting was actually just a desperate, terrified sprint away from the grave?
Wow. That is a really dark premise.
It really is. Today we are examining a startling claim from the book A Brief History of Thought by Luc Ferry. The argument is that the entirety of Western philosophy is not simply a search for knowledge.
Right.
It is fundamentally a quest for salvation, and specifically a quest for salvation achieved through human reason alone, entirely without God.
Which is a massive claim.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Is human reason actually strong enough to save us from our ultimate fear, which is, the fear of our own death?
And this conversation is a critique of that exact vision. We are going to put Ferry's bold claim under real pressure. We will evaluate his core assumptions, trace the logical consequences of his arguments, and see if his conclusions actually protect human dignity.
You're experiencing a unique two-voice conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper book analysis, presented by Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.
So before we critique his final conclusions, we really need to build the strongest version of his argument. We must generously credit Ferry for his ambition here.
Yeah, I completely agree.
He does not just give us a dry timeline of historical facts. He shows us the fatal flaws that caused monumental belief systems to basically collapse under their own weight.
And our mission today requires a specific balance.
Yes. We will dedicate roughly 65% of our time summarizing Ferry's brilliant historical synthesis.
And then 35% for the rigorous critique.
Exactly. We must acknowledge his masterful ability to connect eras of thought. But at the same time, we must evaluate his logical blind spots. We will closely examine his strict separation of reason from faith.
Right. And finally, we will question the ultimate solution he proposes for modern life.
So let us unpack the fundamental structure he uses to evaluate these eras. According to the author, every great philosophical system must answer three inseparable questions.
Okay, what is the first one?
First is the realm of theoria. This asks about the fundamental nature of reality. What is the universe and how do we fit into it?
Theoria. Okay, got it. And the second?
Second is ethics. Once we understand reality, how should we live together? What are the rules of the road?
Makes sense. And the third?
Third, and most crucially for Ferry, is salvation. How do we overcome the paralyzing fear of our own mortality?
Right, so that three-part framework is really the engine of the entire book.
It is. Ferry insists that a complete philosophy must address all three dimensions. If a philosophical system offers a brilliant theory of reality and it provides a strong ethical guide, but it fails to answer the existential terror of death, it is fundamentally incomplete.
It has to help you face the end of your life.
Exactly.
I picture this as a three-legged stool.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so you can have a perfectly carved leg for theory, you can have a sturdy, reinforced leg for ethics, but if that third leg, salvation, is missing or broken, the stool is basically useless.
Right. The moment you put any real weight on it, it collapses.
And the fear of death is the absolute weight of the human condition.
That analogy captures the stakes perfectly, and we see that collapse happen clearly when the book examines the Greek Stoics.
Let's talk about them.
Ferry starts with Stoicism to represent the ancient worldview. Their theoria proposed a perfectly ordered, rational cosmos. It was not a universe governed by an external, personal God.
Instead, it was guided by an internal, divine logic. Everything happened exactly as it was meant to happen.
Right. And for the Stoics, salvation was found in a concept called apatheia. But we need to be careful here because this is not apathy as we use the word today.
It doesn't mean just not caring.
Exactly. It means achieving harmony. You merge your individual identity back into the cosmic order. You accept your fate completely without resistance.
Well, I mean, if you are listening to this and trying to apply it to your own life, it sounds incredibly peaceful.
It does. However, we must evaluate the real-world implications of this worldview. If the universe is perfectly ordered exactly as it is, then your primary ethical imperative is simply to accept your place within it.
Which means accepting the existing social hierarchy.
Yes, and historically, that rigid hierarchy included slavery.
The book explicitly acknowledges this historical reality.
It does. A Stoic society views extreme inequality not as a tragedy to be fixed, but as a necessary expression of the cosmic order.
So if we evaluate this logically, a philosophy demanding unquestioning acceptance of a given order totally fails to protect basic human needs.
Absolutely. It fails to protect freedom and equality. If we apply the golden rule and reverse the roles, the enslaved person at the bottom of the hierarchy would certainly not accept this structure as fair or just.
A philosophy that justifies systemic oppression in the name of cosmic harmony is, well, it's ethically hollow. But wait, if the Stoic universe is perfectly ordered and inequality is considered divine, how do we ever break out of that cycle?
Well, according to Ferry, that ethical failure is exactly what sets the stage for the Christian Revolution. Christianity completely upended the Stoic universe.
Right, the impersonal, cold cosmos was replaced by a personal, loving God.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Theoria fundamentally changed, and this shift altered everything about human relations. Because God became human in the Christian narrative, the ethical standards shifted dramatically.
The goal was no longer accepting a natural hierarchy.
No, the new standard became embracing universal equality and free choice. Ferry argues that this was one of the most revolutionary intellectual events in human history.
Because Christianity rejected the Greek notion that some people are born by nature to rule and others to serve. It declared that all human beings possess equal, inherent dignity simply because they are created by God.
Yes, and the author implies that modern secularism owes a massive debt to this theological shift. Ferry claims that modern human rights, such as the vital work done by organizations like Amnesty International, are entirely inconceivable without this specific Christian foundation.
Wait, I have to push back on Ferry's conclusion here.
Mm-hmm.
He openly admits that our modern concepts of equality grew directly out of Christian theology.
Yes, he does.
But doesn't his admission mean that modern secular humanism is just borrowing its ethical weight from a religion it claims to have completely outgrown?
You are hitting on a vital tension in the book. Ferry wants to keep the ethical fruit of Christianity while chopping down the theological tree that grew it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he desperately wants universal human rights, yet he rejects the divine framework that gave those rights their initial absolute value. He wants the insurance policy without paying the premium.
That is a great way to put it. And this logical tension brings us directly into the crisis of modernity.
Right. The scientific revolution arrives and acts like a wrecking ball against both the ancient and medieval worlds.
Thinkers like Copernicus and Newton reveal a terrifying new reality. The cosmos is not a perfectly ordered divine organism. It is a cold, infinite, mathematical void.
The telescope shatters the comforting Stoic order and the medieval Christian cosmology simultaneously.
The book describes this as a moment of profound isolation, right?
It does. Humans were suddenly left completely alone in the universe. They had no support from a living cosmos, and, for secular thinkers, no support from a divine creator.
If you are a philosopher in this era, you have to build a new foundation entirely from scratch.
Exactly. And modern humanism emerges directly from this void. Descartes introduces methodological doubt. He forces humanity to rely entirely on its own critical reason.
And later, Kant builds an ethical system centered completely on human freedom and disinterested action.
Right. Kant argues that an action is only truly ethical if it is driven by universal duty. If you do something good just to get a reward or to avoid punishment, it is not truly ethical.
The ethics of humanism are incredibly strong and rigorously logical, but humanism struggles massively with that third leg of the stool.
It struggles with salvation.
Yeah, because if we are completely alone in a mathematical universe, how do we conquer our fear of death?
Well, because humanism cannot offer personal immortality, it desperately creates what Ferry calls earthly religions.
Right. These earthly religions are movements like nationalism, communism, and extreme patriotism. They offer a cause larger than your own individual life.
The psychological hope is that sacrificing yourself for the cause will make your death meaningful. You achieve a kind of historical immortality by advancing the revolution or defending the nation.
But we must look at the logical consequences of these earthly salvations.
Yes, we must. The results in the 20th century were catastrophic. Utopian dreams justified immense violence. The Gulag was justified in the name of a perfect communist future.
And Auschwitz was justified in the name of a purified nation.
Exactly. When salvation is promised on earth and human beings believe they can build heaven themselves, they will commit any atrocity to achieve it.
Into this immense philosophical and human disaster steps Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yes. Nietzsche looks at the entire history of Western thought and diagnoses a profound sickness. He calls it nihilism.
He argues that Christianity, humanism, and even Stoicism all share the same toxic structure.
The book explains Nietzsche's core critique clearly. These systems all invent a perfect imaginary world. They invent a Christian heaven or a communist utopia or a Kantian realm of pure reason.
And then they use that imaginary world to devalue and judge the actual messy, painful life we are living right now.
Right. Nietzsche sees this as a fundamental hatred of reality.
This is Mindful Moments, where we turn powerful books into clear, rational conversations for readers, students, and educators.
So Nietzsche's proposed solution is the will to power and a concept called amor fati, which translates to the love of fate.
He demands that we abandon all transcendent ideals. We must unconditionally affirm life exactly as it is, with all its suffering, chaos, and pain.
We must say yes to everything.
Which, Nietzsche says just say yes to the chaos.
Right.
Which sounds great if you just spill coffee on your shirt.
Right.
You can just embrace the chaos of a bad morning. But Ferry points out the horrifying limit of this philosophy.
Yes. Before we celebrate Nietzsche's bold deconstruction, we have to critique his ultimate solution. His method of tearing down false idols is brilliant. However, his concept of amor fati offers absolutely no moral defense against real-world atrocities.
If our only ethical compass is to unconditionally affirm whatever happens, how do we ever condemn injustice?
Exactly. As Ferry himself asks, what meaning can the imperative to love fate possibly have when confronted with the reality of a concentration camp?
You cannot just embrace the chaos of a genocide. A philosophy that cannot condemn mass murder is completely morally bankrupt.
And that ethical failure leaves a massive void in modern thought. This brings us directly to Ferry's final constructive proposal for the listener.
He calls it contemporary humanism, or post-Nietzschean humanism.
Right. Ferry completely rejects pure materialism. He knows that simply telling people to eat, drink, and be merry is morally inadequate for a meaningful life.
So instead of materialism, he introduces a concept he calls horizontal transcendence.
Yes, and this is where we need to slow down and explain the mechanics of his argument. He uses an analogy from the philosopher Edmund Husserl to explain this concept.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think of a simple matchbox resting on a table. No matter how you hold it or look at it, you can only ever see 3 sides of it at any one time.
Right, you can't see the back of the bottom.
Exactly. Yet you know with absolute certainty that the hidden sides exist. The reality of the object always exceeds your direct perception.
So you trust that the unseen sides are real.
Yes, and Ferry argues that human experience works the exact same way. Just like we trust the hidden sides of the matchbox are there, Ferry argues we must trust that truth, beauty, and justice exist independently of us.
They are not just subjective illusions we invent in our heads. They are realities that exceed our grasp.
We discover them, we do not manufacture them.
I see. So based on this trust in hidden realities, Ferry argues that love becomes a new secular basis for meaning.
Right. When you sacrifice your own interests for a child or for a loved one, you tap into a reality larger than yourself. Love becomes his secular version of grace.
It gives us a taste of immortality without requiring a divine creator.
Yes.
I'm reading between the lines here, but is Ferry just trying to build a philosophical halfway house?
What do you mean by that?
Well, it feels like he wants to keep all the emotional comfort and moral weight of transcendence. But at the same time, he refuses to pay the metaphysical price of actually believing in God.
Right.
He wants the safety of the harbor without actually dropping the anchor.
That is a highly accurate assessment of his position. And when we evaluate the ethical weight of Ferry's proposal, we see a distinct limitation. His horizontal ethics focus intensely on loving actual human beings in the present moment.
Which protects human dignity and fosters mutual care. It is definitely a noble way to live.
It is noble, but does it actually solve the core problem? Does it truly save us from the finality of death?
It seems to offer profound consolation, but not actual salvation.
It definitely falls short of salvation. And this brings us to a necessary logical critique of the very foundation of Ferry's argument. The entire book rests on a massive, unquestioned assumption.
What is the assumption?
Ferry strictly defines philosophy as the exercise of reason alone. And simultaneously, he strictly defines religion as nothing more than blind faith.
Oh, wow. This creates a classic false dichotomy, doesn't it?
It really does. By defining his terms this way, Ferry artificially rigs the intellectual game from the very first chapter.
Because he completely ignores a massive, centuries-long tradition of Christian philosophy. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Ogden did not abandon reason.
Exactly. They used rigorous logic, deep metaphysical inquiry, and rational argument to justify and explore their faith. By excluding this entire tradition, Ferry avoids confronting the strongest rational arguments against his purely secular premise.
This logical maneuver leads to the most striking concession in the entire book. Near the end of his exploration, Ferry openly admits something incredible.
He does. He admits that Christianity's version of salvation is the most effective and powerful ever offered to humanity.
He acknowledges that the Christian promise of personal immortality and eternal love actually solves the paralyzing fear of death. It completes the three-legged stool perfectly.
Yet he rejects it entirely. He rejects it simply because it relies on an other. It relies on a transcendent God rather than relying on human autonomy.
I have to ask, is Ferry begging the question here?
How so?
Well, he presupposes from the beginning that legitimate salvation must come from within human reason. He sets a rule that salvation must be self-generated. Then he rejects Christianity for violating a rule that he himself invented without ever proving why that rule must be absolute.
He is undeniably employing a circular argument. He assumes his conclusion in his premise.
Which brings us to our final verdict on a brief history of thought. We must remain balanced in our assessment. The book is not a flawless guide to ultimate truth. Its foundational definitions are heavily biased.
It is not a flawless guide, but it is a genuinely brilliant sparring partner. It forces you to clarify your own belief.
Its errors in defining faith and reason are just as instructive as its masterful synthesis of historical eras.
Exactly. Ferry forces every reader to confront the terrifying reality of death head-on. He effectively demonstrates that pure, cynical materialism is a philosophical dead end.
And even if his secular humanist solution ultimately falls short of providing true, lasting salvation, his defense of human dignity is powerful. His exploration of the transcendent power of love is deeply moving and intellectually serious.
It is a book that demands a response from the reader. If these philosophical arguments and historical shifts resonate with you, the full suite of reviews for this book is available.
Right. The essential insights and summary provide the foundational map for the book's complex arguments. This critique tests its deepest claims and underlying logic.
Here are questions to carry into your own reading of this book. First, if human rights truly originated in Christian theology, as Ferry clearly claims, can those rights survive long-term in a purely secular framework that rejects their origin?
That is a great question.
Second, does Ferry's strict separation of reason and faith artificially limit the human search for ultimate truth?
Click the link on screen for related episodes, essential insights, summary, analysis, critique, or deep critique. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link if you'd like to read along and think rationally.
Explore the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments and nourish your mind on the go.
As you navigate your own life, consider Ferry's three-legged stool. Look closely at the foundational beliefs you rely on every day. When the inevitable heavy weight of mortality finally rests upon them, will they hold firm or will they splinter beneath you?